Hey guys, tonight we begin with a true story they tried to erase. In 1278, a blacksmith's apprentice named Tomas was sentenced to death for loving the daughter of a warlord. But here's what no one expected. She followed him to the gallows, not to save him, but to die beside him. What if I told you their final kiss sparked riots in 3 kingdoms? What if I told you a single note smuggled in a bread loaf rewrote the laws of marriage across half of Europe? And here's what may stay with you. Some of the most heartbreaking poems in medieval history were written by a girl locked in a tower, praying her lover was still alive. Before we dive into these incredible true stories, here's what would absolutely make my night. If this gives you chills, and I promise it will, hit that subscribe button and tap that like. But here's what I'm really curious about. What time is it where you are right now? Are you cozy in bed in California? Maybe it's morning coffee time in London. Drop your time zone in the comments, because I love knowing we're sharing these stories together across the world. Now, let's dim those lights, get comfortable, and travel back to a time when falling in love could literally cost you everything. Picture this. You're living in the year 1200 and love isn't a choice, it's a crime. Not metaphorically, literally. In medieval Europe, choosing your heart over your family's wishes could get you disinherited, exiled, or worse. And the statistics from surviving court records are absolutely mind-blowing. In Hungary alone, over 200 known cases exist of lovers executed not for infidelity, not for crimes, but simply for marrying the wrong person. It was a time when love was considered a dangerous rebellion and obedience was the currency of survival. Marriage wasn't a bond of the heart. It was a contract between houses, sealed with land, coin, and sometimes blood. And still, people fell in love, quietly, recklessly, sometimes fatally. In the year 1278, beneath the winter-shadowed peaks of the northern Hungarian marches, there lived a noble family whose name echoed through the court like a hymn and a warning: House Kalman. Their estate was a fortress wrapped in ivy and frost, sitting atop land soaked in both war and wine. The Kalman crest bore a black falcon on red, and their legacy was built not on mercy, but alliances carved with steel. Lucia Kalman was 17, the only daughter, promised in marriage to a man she'd never met, the son of a rival warlord whose cruelty was whispered about across borderlands. The betrothal was political, strategic, inevitable. But fate doesn't care for arrangements. Down in the village below the Kalman estate, beside the soot-smudged stables and the forge that bellowed fire all day long, worked Tomas. Just 19, the son of a widowed farrier, he had rough hands and quiet eyes, and a way of working iron that seemed to calm the very flames. No one noticed when she passed him the first time. No one noticed the way her carriage slowed or the way he looked up, only for a moment. It could have ended there. A glance. A story that never starts. But it didn't. In the chapel library where Lucia spent her afternoons copying Latin verse, Tomas delivered iron-bound books. In the orchard that skirted the manor's outer wall, he came to mend the broken gate. These weren't meetings, just moments, brief, breathless. And still, love began to take root, not like a spark, but like ivy, quiet, creeping, unstoppable. No one spoke of it, of course. How could they? She was nobility, he was nobody. Even the idea was treason. In those days, courts issued what were called marital decrees, official orders that declared certain unions invalid, punishable by death. And beneath the gallows tree in the town square, couples who defied those decrees were made examples of. It was said the rope didn't just hang bodies, it hung warnings. And yet, even knowing that, they continued. They began leaving letters for each other in the folds of chapel hymnals. Nothing dramatic, just thoughts, a line from a poem, a pressed flower, a scrap of parchment that still carried the warmth of the hand that wrote it. These fragments became their language, soft and secret, a rebellion made not of swords, but of sentences. In the village, there were rumours. A nobleman had seen her riding alone too often. A servant whispered of her smile when Tomas passed. Her father, Lord Calman, began asking questions, and that's when the sky seemed to shift. In late autumn, when the leaves burned gold and the wind turned sharp, Lucia was summoned. Her wedding would be moved forward. The warlord's son would arrive in 3 weeks' time. Preparations would begin immediately. The letters stopped for a while, not because they wanted them to, but because there was nowhere safe enough to leave them. Tomas returned to his forge. Lucia stayed behind the estate walls. But even then, in the quiet, love did not leave them. It waited. Then something extraordinary happened. A letter, smuggled inside a loaf of bread by a sympathetic kitchen girl, arrived in Thomas's hands. It said only one thing: "Meet me where the apples fall." It was a phrase from a story Lucia loved, where lovers reunited in a field of wind-blown trees. He knew where to go. That night, under moonlight filtered through bare branches, they met in the abandoned orchard. No promises, no plans, just presence. They sat on the earth, shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting into the night, and they simply stayed. They were caught, not that night, but days later, by a huntsman who followed tracks through snow to where Lucia had hidden a small, carved trinket Tomas had given her, a pendant shaped like a rose, forged from a blackened horseshoe nail, a gift, a mistake, enough to condemn. What followed was silence. Tomas was seized without warning, dragged from his forge in the dark. Lucia was locked in the eastern tower, where the windows faced no light and the door bore 3 iron bolts. Their trial was brief. The charge, consorting beneath her station with intent to betray a political union. The sentence, public execution by gallows at dawn. But that was not how their story ended, because on the eve of death something happened that would echo through history and fracture the laws of the land, and that is where we go next. Before the gallows, before the sentence, before the orchard and the pendant and the whispers that would follow them like shadows, there was a library. Long before their love was a rebellion, it was a glance, quiet, accidental, almost forgettable, but some moments hide their weight beneath stillness. The monastery of St. Istvan stood just beyond the village's northern ridge, cloaked in ivy and the slow breath of time. It was a place where silence settled in corners like dust, where the cold stone echoed with the soft shuffle of robes and parchment. Within its walls, among oil lamps and hand-copied scrolls, the air always smelled faintly of beeswax, leather, and forgotten secrets. It was here that Tomas first learned to read. He had not been granted the privilege by birth. His family bore no crest. His father died with soot on his hands, not scripture in them. But Brother Andor, an old monk with shaking fingers and a soft heart, had seen something in Tomas, a kind of stillness behind his eyes, a hunger that was not for food. And so, quietly, after the forge closed and the sky turned violet, Tomas came to the library. He never read aloud. He traced letters with the tip of his finger, Latin, then Old Hungarian, a bit of Italian. Slowly, the world opened. The monks did not speak of it, some frowned, but in the quiet order of monastic life, there were many small mercies that lived between the rules. Lucia came to the monastery for entirely different reasons. The Calman family funded the scriptorium, an attempt at piety, perhaps, or politics. Once a week, Lucia rode up to the monastery with her governess, cloaked in deep blue, her hair braided like a coronet. Her hands were gloved, her presence formal. She entered not as a girl, but as a symbol. She came to copy scripture, to practice Latin verse, to be seen fulfilling the virtues expected of a noble daughter, but something was called her back each week, a hunger that had nothing to do with duty. She would linger in the lower chamber, where the secular texts were stored, where Dante's verses rested in soft leather, and Ovid's stories whispered from shelves like half-remembered dreams. There was no music in the monastery, but the words were music enough. And one afternoon, in the late light of early spring, their paths crossed. Tomas had come early. The forge had closed early that day, and Brother Andor had given him permission to read alone. He sat by the window, fingers ink-smudged, the leather-bound scroll spread carefully before him. He was reading too slowly to notice her at first, but when the door creaked open and Lucia stepped inside, the air changed. She saw him, not the boy, not the soot-stained apron folded on the bench, not the ink blot near his collar. She saw the eyes, quiet and startled, lit with something between guilt and wonder. And then she looked down at the scroll he was reading. It was La Vita Nuova, the words of Dante, a story about a man who loved a woman from afar, a woman whose very name became his prayer. There was no greeting, no movement, just a shared breath and the knowledge that they were not supposed to be in the same room, much less share the same air. Lucia turned away first, but slowly, not out of fear, but caution, curiosity, the soft echo of fate turning its first page. From that moment forward, their paths began to curve gently toward each other. They would not speak. Not then, not for many weeks. But their schedules began to change. Tomas arrived later. Lucia lingered longer. He returned books more frequently. She borrowed ones from the same shelf. Every glance became a tether, every shared silence a thread. The monks noticed nothing, or pretended to. The library remained a place of ritual, of restraint. But beneath the careful routines, something fragile and electric began to bloom. It was not passion yet, not even affection, but a recognition, as if two matching verses had found each other in different corners of the same song. Lucia began copying passages into her own notebooks, quotes that held no relevance to her studies, lines about impossible love, about hidden longing. She folded the pages neatly and tucked them between psalms. Tomas would later find them, unnoticed by all except the one they were meant for. He responded in kind, not with words, his script was clumsy still, but with small offerings, a pressed violet inside a copy of Augustine's Confessions, a sliver of parchment with a single line in his own hand. I read what you leave. The monastery remained still. Its bells chimed the hours. Its prayers rose like smoke. But in the quiet corners of that dusty library, something sacred was stirring, something more dangerous than heresy, more fragile than parchment. Love had not yet spoken, but it had opened its eyes. And just beyond the cloister walls, the world waited, with laws, with chains, with names etched into contracts and inked into bloodlines, the kind of world that does not forgive secrets, especially the tender kind. The scrolls would remain, the sparks would remain, but this was only the beginning. The orchard still lay silent, the gallows still cast their long shadow, and far beneath it all, two hearts had just begun to turn toward each other in the stillness. The summer came slowly that year, drawn out like the breath before a confession. The days lengthened, stretching golden across the hills, and the wind that once bit now softened to a breeze. The land was green and full, the rivers calm, and for a while the world seemed to hold its violence in its hands without using it. But beneath the stillness, something was shifting. The midsummer festival arrived like it always did, quietly grand, a feast of fire and tradition, held beneath the open sky with music, offerings and rituals older than the chapel stones themselves. Lanterns lined the edge of the fields. Banners were raised, wine flowed in the manor halls, and villagers danced by the well where generations had been blessed or buried. Lucia was present, of course, draped in silver silk, her hair woven with rosemary and pearl. Her presence alone held the attention of the nobility gathered around the fire-lit courtyard. She was not just a daughter that evening. She was the promise of alliance, of land and name, of power. Her father's legacy wrapped in satin and lineage. Tomas stood among the shadows, not invited, but not hidden either. Every blacksmith was needed on such a day. Fires had to be stoked, horses shod, torches set in iron. He worked quietly, dressed plainly, and yet his presence lingered at the edge of the flame. Their paths should not have crossed, not that evening, not in the middle of the crowd beneath watchful eyes. But fate, once stirred, does not retreat so easily. Near the edge of the estate grounds, behind the chapel ruins, where the old stones had crumbled into moss and dust, the world grew quiet. The music dimmed. The sounds of laughter and formality faded into the distance. And in that hushed space, between shadow and stone, Lucia found herself alone. She had followed instinct, not intention. The crowd had pressed too closely. The glances from older me, and heavy with expectation, the whispers of names, hers and those not yet hers, the weight of it all pressed inward, and she drifted away like smoke escaping from a candle's edge. She wasn't surprised to see him there. Tomas had also found the ruins, maybe seeking stillness, maybe something else. The chapel had once held weddings before the new abbey was built. Now it was just a skeleton of stone and memory, softened by time, overtaken by ivy. They did not speak, not with words. They hadn't spoken at all, not even once. But the silence between them had grown dense with understanding. It was not absence, it was permission, a language deeper than speech. The sky above them was scattered with stars, the last pink of twilight vanishing behind the distant hills. And there, between the old altar stones, the kiss arrived. Not as ceremony, not even as intention, but as gravity. It was not the kiss of a fairy tale, not soft or imagined. It was urgent, fragile, like two halves of something breaking open. There was no promise, no declaration, just the truth of it, unspoken, undeniable. Above them, the banners of rival families stirred in the wind, colours of war and legacy, stitched with symbols of old blood. Somewhere nearby, a nobleman toasted to the future. Elsewhere, a servant poured wine and counted coins. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The houses, the titles, the iron laws carved into scrolls and bound by family seals. Because in the ruins of a chapel built for vows, two souls had just written one without permission, and like all vows spoken against the will of the world, it echoed into places it wasn't meant to reach. They parted before they were missed, slipped back into their places like threads into cloth, but the world around them no longer fit. Everything that came after would feel different. Lucia returned to the manor, eyes lowered but mind distant. She sat beside her father's advisers with her hands folded and her voice obedient. But inside, a new kind of silence had formed. Not the stillness of duty, but the quiet of knowing something no one else could take from her. Tomas returned to the forge the next day. The flames still roared, the anvil still rang, but his work felt lighter, as if something heavy had shifted. The kiss changed nothing, but it changed everything. It did not delay her betrothal. It did not stop the plans. The marriage contracts were still being prepared, wax seals waiting to be pressed. The warlord's son would still arrive, the dowry would still be counted, the land still promised. But in the space behind the chapel, where broken stones remembered what the world tried to forget, two people had dared to believe in something unpermitted. Not love yet, not fully, but a beginning. and beginnings are the most dangerous part of any story, especially when they start with fire and end with fate. Soon the letters would begin, the watches, the vows whispered into parchment and hidden behind altar books. Soon the silence would be broken. But not yet. Tonight the world still slept, and somewhere beneath it love had drawn its first breath. In the days that followed the midsummer festival, the world seemed unchanged on the surface. The manor continued its routines. The bells of the monastery still rang at dawn. Horses were fed, scrolls were copied, bread was baked. But within Lucia something had shifted. A silence had been broken, not aloud, but inward. The kiss had awakened something she could not dismiss. Not infatuation, not even desire. It was the weightless certainty of knowing something true, even when no one else could name it. But truth, in her world, was not safety. It was risk. And risk, if spoken to the wrong ears, could become ruin. So for a time she said nothing. She carried the moment like a secret pressed between pages of scripture, hidden in plain sight, but never read aloud. But secrets grow heavier the longer they are carried alone. It was in the quiet cloisters of St. Istvan that she found the one soul who would understand. Sister Miriam had served the monastery since before Lucia was born. Her presence was steady and unassuming, neither young nor old, neither severe nor sweet. She moved through the abbey with the grace of someone who no longer feared being seen or forgotten. She was the keeper of candles and copied texts, of quiet corrections and tea leaves, left steeping in old cups. Few spoke to her beyond necessity. Fewer still noticed the softness in her gaze. Lucia had always liked her, though she hadn't known why. There was a calmness to her that did not come from doctrine, but from something older, some quiet kind of knowing. So one afternoon, while the wind curled lazily through the cloister arches and the world beyond seemed far away, Lucia lingered. She stayed after her lesson longer than she should have, her hands folded in stillness, her eyes refusing to rise. And when Sister Miriam approached, something unspoken passed between them. Not a question, not quite concern, but an invitation, made not with words but with presence. That was how it began, a slow unravelling of silence, a confession not spoken as sin, but as weight offered gently into the hands of someone who would not recoil. Lucia did not name him, she didn't have to. She spoke not of his face, but of the ache, not of the moment behind the chapel, but of the knowing that it could not have been a mistake. She spoke of fear and wonder and the feeling that she had walked through some invisible threshold and could never return unchanged. And Sister Miriam, who had heard many things in her time, fear disguised as piety, longing buried beneath ritual, listened without interruption. Her silence did not judge, it held. There was something in her stillness that made Lucia pause, something familiar but hidden beneath layers of time. And then, softly, Sister Miriam spoke, not in the way of sermons or psalms, but with the memory of someone who had once stood in a very different kind of light. Long ago, she had been a novice, not in this monastery, but in another, nestled near the western borders, where the land was thick with pine and snow. She had taken her vows with sincere heart, but even sincerity is not always a shield. There had been another novice. Her name Sister Miriam did not offer, only that they had shared candlelight and scripture, and then something else, something unnamed but deeply felt. It had never been spoken aloud, never crossed the threshold into scandal or sin, but the heart knows its own measures, and Miriam had carried that love not as guilt, but as memory, as something she chose to keep instead of surrender. She had remained in the order, she had kept her silence, but she had never unmade what had been felt. When she finished, the wind had quieted, and the candles burned low. The moment passed like a tide, and the world did not shift, but within Lucia something softened. It was not approval, it was not instruction, it was something rarer, understanding. Sometimes love finds its way not through gates or open doors, but through locked hearts that still remember how it feels to open. Sometimes the most unexpected robes hold the oldest secrets. From that day forward, Lucia no longer felt entirely alone. She returned to the monastery not only for her lessons, but for brief, silent exchanges, a pressed hand, a knowing glance, a passage left dog-eared in a book, nothing spoken, everything understood. In time, Sister Miriam became more than a presence. She became a quiet guardian. She noticed the changes in schedule, the absence of a certain scroll, the soft tremble in Lucia's voice when certain names were mentioned, and she said nothing. But in her silence, she built a shelter outs. By day, the summer deepened. Tomas continued his quiet labour. Lucia continued her quiet rebellion. Their meetings remained rare, their words even rarer. But between them flowed an understanding that no law had sanctioned, no rite had blessed, and yet it thrived. Soon their secret would grow heavier. Soon the world would draw closer. There would be choices and consequences, and lines that once crossed could never be uncrossed. But for now, a kiss had been remembered. A heart had been heard. And in the stillness of the monastery, a vow was made, not aloud, but deeply. Love, no matter how forbidden, would not be buried in silence. And Sister Miriam, the nun who knew, would help protect it for as long as she could. The summer waned slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The heat softened, the light shifted, fields turned from green to gold, and shadows began to lengthen at the edges of day. But within the walls of House Kalman something colder was settling. Rumours had begun to stir. Nothing clear, nothing said outright, just soft murmurs passed between servants. A stable boy who claimed to have seen Lucia alone near the forge, a noblewoman who questioned the sudden quiet between suitors, a missing pendant found buried in the folds of Lucia's cloak, shaped like a rose hammered from iron. Too many small truths were aligning, and in noble courts suspicion moves faster than certainty. Lucia was locked away, not as punishment, but as preservation. That was what her father claimed. The eastern tower of the manor, once a guest chamber, now hollow with disuse, was chosen as her sanctuary, a place to reflect, to remember her station, to wait for the arrival of the warlord's son. The room was high and narrow, with leaded glass windows and thick stone walls. From its height, she could see the hills in the distance, where the monastery bell tower rose like a sentinel, but she could not hear it. The silence was too thick. Days passed in stillness. Her meals were brought without word. Her books were returned without comment. She was alone, but not forgotten, not entirely. A page boy named Stefan remained loyal, young, watchful, quiet. He had served in the Kalman household since childhood, and though he knew better than to ask questions, he also knew where Lucia's gaze lingered longest, toward the hills, toward the monastery, toward the places no longer permitted. And so a quiet rebellion was born. The letters began not on parchment, but in books. Lucia still received scripture and poetry from the manor's small library, delivered by Stefan each week, illuminated manuscripts filled with gold leaf, saints' lives, and sacred verse. But between those holy lines, other messages began to appear, hidden in initial capitals, woven into the borders, camouflaged within decoration. At first, just marks, a dot above a word, a petal added where none belonged, a red thread loosely tied to a ribboned bookmark. Then came codes, acrostics, where the first letters of each line, when read downward, formed phrases only one other would understand. Latin phrases with unusual spelling, marginalia in a different hand just faint enough to pass as age. Stefan carried them without question. He delivered the books to the monastery under the guise of donation or copying. He brought others back from Tomas, marked in kind. They passed through shelves and hands, through candlelight and dust. through eyes that did not see what they were not meant to see. The letters became lifelines, not dramatic, not romantic in the way the world imagines. They were brief, spare, careful, but in them lived hope. In one, Tomas included a passage from Virgil, copied in his own hand. Love conquers all. Let us too yield to love. Lucia responded with a verse from the Psalms, slightly altered. Though I walk through the valley, I will not fear, for I am not alone. They shared weather, memories, small moments only they would remember. A breeze through the orchard, the weight of a glance across the scriptorium, the smell of iron and ink. Sister Miriam too became part of the network, though she never said so aloud. A page missing here, a delay in return there, gaps that allowed messages to pass safely through sacred hands. The world outside Lucia's window moved forward. Her betrothed was drawing near. The manor buzzed with preparations, silks unfolded, guest rooms aired, wine barrels tapped. The ceremony would be swift, political, irrevocable. And yet in the narrow tower, a kind of stillness settled over Lucia, not resignation, not despair, but clarity. She knew now that her heart would not be handed over like a coin or a tract of land. It had already been given, freely and fully, sealed in ink and memory. In the margins of her books, she no longer left messages. She left maps, symbolic trails Tomas would understand, references to places only they had shared. Behind the chapel, the old orchard, the hidden staircase in the scriptorium. If ever she were moved, taken, married off, or disappeared, he would know where she had been, and where she might be again. Each note became a thread, fragile but unbroken. And Tomas, though distant, responded not with protest or grief, but with resolve. He sent her a page from a bestiary, hand-drawn in charcoal, the image of a falcon, eyes fierce, wings unfurled. Beneath it only one line written in Latin, "She cannot be caged." In a world built on chains of duty, of law, of class, two souls had built a bridge of parchment, and Enke, not enough to save them, not yet, but enough to endure. Soon the chain would tighten, the wedding would draw closer, the choices would vanish one by one. But tonight, a book lay open beneath a candle's glow, and between the painted saints and sacred words, love lived quietly, in code, in breath, in pages passed hand to hand like prayers. The tower held her body, but her heart was elsewhere, and soon the chain would pull taut. The days before the wedding moved like clockwork, each tick of preparation closing the distance between Lucia and a future she had not chosen. In the manor, voices grew louder. Decisions were made without her. The guest list grew. The halls were dressed in gold and crimson. Every corner of the estate began to echo with rehearsed celebration. But high in the tower, silence still lived. Lucia continued to mark her pages, though fewer now. The codes were becoming harder to pass. The watch on her chamber had grown tighter. Her attendants had changed. Fewer familiar faces, more closed doors. Tomas, however, had not been still. The messages had ceased only outwardly, but beneath the cover of darkness he had begun to move, quietly, deliberately. With help from sympathetic hands and trusted whispers, he had entered the manor grounds once before, once, and then again, always unseen, always just long enough to leave something behind, a sign, a fragment, a line she would find in the folds of a book or the seam of a curtain. But then came the night when the wind turned colder and the moon hung lower than usual, as if watching from above. That night Tomas was seen. The east wing of the manor was rarely patrolled. The tower had no visitors scheduled, and yet footsteps echoed in the stone corridor. A servant, startled by movement, lit a lantern. Steel glinted in the dark. Voices rose. and in a flash of panic what had been silent became known. Tomas was dragged into the light. The noblemen gathered quickly, among them Lucia's betrothed, Aric, son of a warlord, bred in battle and arrogance. He had not yet touched his bride, but he had claimed her with the certainty of ownership, and now, seeing Tomas in her corridor, dishevelled, breathless, and unapologetically present, he saw only one thing, offence, and in his world offence was settled in blood. The challenge was made before doors. Basil, it was not formal, it was not lawful, but it was accepted. Tomas had no armour, no rank, no right to fight a nobleman, but he had fire in his eyes, and something greater than pride driving his hand. The duel took place in the courtyard beneath the stone arch of the manor's old gate. No audience was summoned, but word travelled faster than wind. By the time steel met steel, the edge of the walls were lined with silent watchers, servants, guards, even a monk from the monastery, face hidden beneath his hood. Aric fought with precision, trained and confident. Tomas moved with instinct, forged by muscle and fire. Their swords clashed in rhythms that neither expected. It was not art, it was not ceremony, it was something older, raw, human, desperate. And in the final breath of the fight, Tomas won. He disarmed the nobleman with a strike that sent the blade clattering across the stone. Aric stumbled, breath caught in his throat, and for a moment all stood still. Tomas raised his dagger. The watchers leaned forward, but he did not strike. He held the blade a moment longer, then let it fall to the ground. He would not take a life, not even in victory. The silence broke like glass. What should have been honour became insult. Mercy in the eyes of nobility was a kind of humiliation, and in that moment Tomas was no longer a man defending love. He was an outlaw who had bested blood, a criminal who had touched what he should not have dared to look upon. Lucia, hearing of the duel, did not wait for consequence. That night she left the tower. It was not a dramatic escape. No ropes, no stolen horses, just a key left carelessly by a sleepy guard, a window left unlatched, a corridor unlit. The map had already been written weeks before in the margins of her books. She followed the path inked in silence, and at the edge of the orchard, in the space where they had first been more than strangers, Tomas waited. Together they fled. Not to freedom, there was no such thing, not yet, but to elsewhere, to shadowed roads, to river paths known only by fishermen and monks, to places where names meant nothing and stories were left untold. The manor would rise in anger, the Kalman name would burn in fury, decrees would be signed, rewards offered, faces sketched and nailed to posts. Their love was no longer hidden, it had become a crime. But love, once cast into fire, either burns away or becomes something brighter. They left behind everything they had known, titles, walls, duties, books, and walked forward with only what they could carry. A rose-shaped pendant, a page marked with a falcon's eye, and the memory of a kiss exchanged behind ruined stone on the night they chose each other over the world. Their story was no longer a secret. It was a storm, and the world would feel its thunder soon. The road away from the manor was long and without language. Forest paths whispered beneath their feet. Rivers passed beside them like breath. The stars overhead gave no direction, only dim light scattered across an uncertain world. But forward was the only choice. There was no turning back. Tomas and Lucia became shadows moving through the world, unseen, unspoken of, yet hunted. The duel had marked him. Her disappearance had sealed them both in silence and shame. Bounty riders followed behind, their names now listed among traitors and thieves. But amid the danger, something else grew. Stillness. Not peace, but a kind of quiet sorrow. The knowledge that even though they had escaped one prison, they had stepped into another. Love in exile was still love in chains. They crossed the borderlands by foot, avoiding roads, carried little, slept beneath trees. For a time, the rhythm of movement became its own refuge, but winter threatened on the wind, and they needed a place to disappear. It was Tomas who remembered the monastery. Not St. Istvan, but a much older one, St. Balint's Abbey, deep in the southern hills, buried in fog and fir trees. It had once been a place of healing during the old wars, then abandoned, then quietly repopulated by a small order of contemplative monks. Men who spoke little, who wrote in the margins of time, and who welcomed silence more than questions. Tomas had passed there once in his youth. He remembered its broken bell tower, its worn stone paths, the fields of herbs grown for medicine, not beauty. They arrived beneath a sky thick with grey just before the snow began to fall. The abbey took them in, slowly, quietly. No names were asked, only that Tomas worked for his shelter, repairing tools, stoking fires, tending the older monks who moved now with a lifetime of prayer carved into their bones. Lucia did not stay in the guests' wing. That would haunt. Ave drawn notice. Instead, her hair was cut, her name changed. She was taken in as a novice by the order of sisters that lived just beyond the outer wall, across the cold cloister garden. It was Sister Miriam who had once mentioned the place, long ago when Lucia was only dreaming of escape. And now it became real. She wore the same linen, ate the same bread, woke to the same bells, and yet, inside her heart, the rhythms beat differently. Lucia and Tomas were no longer lovers in secret. They were lovers in silence. They saw each other only from across the chapel aisle, when morning prayer began, and again at dusk. They passed one another in hallways lined with candle smoke, never touching. They moved like ghosts in the lives they had chosen, barely acknowledging what once burned between them. But love, when pressed into stillness, does not vanish. It deepens. It waits. The monastery became a tomb of sorts, not of death, but of what could not be spoken aloud. Like Heloise and Abelard in their final years, they lived near each other, bound by proximity, separated by vows neither had taken, but both respected. Their passion became restraint, their words became glances, and in the small corners of the monastery's old stones they left signs. A flower pressed into a prayer book, a candle lit when none was needed, a single feather left on the sill of a cell window, quiet echoes of what could not be declared. Outside the snow came, roads closed, the world faded behind white and wind. Within the abbey, Tomas began to copy manuscripts by hand, not because he was told to, but because it gave him purpose. He copied saints' lives, then psalms, then slowly, carefully, began to illuminate his own lines, hidden in the scrollwork. Lucia read them. Lines only she would recognize, images only they would understand. A falcon's wing, a rose with iron petals, the outline of a tower with a single window open. The other sisters never asked why she lingered over those pages longer than the others, why she sometimes walked the cloister long after the evening bells, why she stood by the winter garden's frozen fountain, eyes cast downward, lips unmoving, as if reciting a prayer that had never been written. Time passed like a slow river beneath ice. Weeks folded into one another. Snow fell, then melted. The silence held. But even in stillness, tension grows. Bounty riders had not stopped searching. News of them reached the abbey through merchants and travellers. The warlord's men had not forgotten the insult. Lucia's family had not forgiven the shame. And the longer the lovers remained hidden, the more dangerous their quiet became. The monastery had been sanctuary, but soon it would no longer be enough. In the stillness, love had survived. But survival was not the same as freedom, and beyond the stone walls the world had not grown kinder. It had only grown closer. The snow had begun to thaw when the message arrived. Spring returned not with warmth but with wind, soft, unsure, brushing gently across the edges of the monastery garden. The ground was still hard, the air still cold, but something was shifting. It came in the form of a letter folded once, sealed in deep blue wax. Lucia's brother had found them. He had written not with fury, but with forgiveness. The letter spoke of peace, of resolution, of home. It told of her father's health fading, of regrets unspoken, of a family torn apart and longing to heal. It carried no threats, only invitation. He promised safe passage, promised a pardon, promised that the warlord's son had moved on, that her absence had been softened by time, that the name Kalman still held room for her, and for Tomas, if only they would return and make peace. Lucia read the letter 3 times. The wax was familiar, the handwriting unmistakable. Her brother's words, though formal, did not seem false. There was something weary in the lines, as if he too had grown tired of exile, of secrets, of the wound their defiance had left on the family's legacy. At first Tomas refused. He knew the world better than she did. He knew the weight of noble promises when made without witness. But Lucia's heart was softer, or perhaps simply more willing to believe that love, once so fiercely punished, might now be allowed to return, if only under the right terms. The monks, sensing change, offered no advice, only shelter if they chose to remain. But the air inside the monastery had grown thinner, the silence heavier, and love, once nurtured by nearness, had begun to hunger for something more than quiet glances and coded pages. And so they decided. Together they packed what little they had, a pouch of coins, a single cloak, a book Tomas had copied by hand, bound in simple leather, the rose pendant she still wore beneath a linen, and the memory of a winter that had almost kept them safe. They travelled by cart. A merchant known to the monastery agreed to take them north. The journey was slow, the road still muddy from the thaw, the hills dark with rain. But Lucia's heart began to stir. The thought of home no longer felt like defeat. It felt almost like the end of a long sentence, a return to language, to self. When they reached the edge of Kalman land, they were met by riders, not soldiers, escorts. Her brother's seal bore no armour, only welcome. He arrived in person, dressed in muted colours, his expression unreadable but calm. He embraced her gently, spoke of change, spoke of letting the past die with the frost. Tomas remained cautious but quiet. They entered the estate through a side gate, not the one they had fled, but one meant for dignity, not shame, and for a moment it seemed real. They were led to a small hall, newly restored. Fire crackled in the hearth, wine was poured, a table was set with bread and soft fruit. The family crest hung above, as if time had been rewound, and none of it had ever happened. Lucia ate slowly. The wine tasted familiar, bitter at first, then soft. Tomas did not eat. He watched her carefully, his hand never far from hers beneath the table. Her brother smiled, raised his cup. But in the minutes that followed, something shifted. Lucia's breath slowed. Her hands, once steady, began to tremble. Her gaze blurred, then fixed on nothing. The room seemed to move without moving. Her body leaned forward, then sideways. Tomas caught her before she fell. The poison was not strong enough to kill, not yet, but it was designed to silence, to weaken, to render her docile, compliant. A potion to make her forget resistance, to bend her will. It mirrored the sleeping draughts once whispered of in apothecary corners, the kind used by desperate lovers to fake death and escape fate. But this was not theatre, this was betrayal, quiet and final. Tomas lifted her into his arms, his heart beating against time. Her brother did not move to stop him, he simply watched. The look on his face was not hatred, it was resignation. There had never been peace. The letter had been bait, the pardon had been a lie. Lucia had been returned not to her family, but to their control. Tomas did not speak. He moved swiftly, carrying her through the halls they once feared, through a door left unbarred, through the courtyard now empty of guards. He did not stop until they reached the orchard. The trees were bare now, stripped of blossoms, but the ground remembered their steps, the place remembered their first kiss, and there, beneath the branches that once sheltered hope, he lay her gently on the moss-covered stone. Her breath was shallow but present. Her pulse flickered, steady, then uncertain. He did not cry. Instead, he opened the leather-bound book he had carried, the one he had copied for her by hand. Inside its final pages, he had written a prayer, not in Latin, not in scripture, but in the words they had created together, quiet, hidden, sacred. He read them aloud. The wind answered, and beside her he waited for the poison to pass, or to take her. She woke slowly, as though surfacing from the bottom of a long, dreamless sea. Lucia's first breath came shallow, her second steadier. Around her the orchard shimmered in the early light, quiet, grey, cold. Tomas sat beside her, his eyes rimmed with weariness, his hands still clasping hers, as though he might tether her soul to her body if he just held tightly enough. The poison had not claimed her, not fully, but something inside her had shifted. A softness now lingered where certainty once lived, a quiet, detached sense of knowing, like a candle that has burned low, its wax barely holding to its shape. They did not return to the manor. They turned south again, toward the monastery, toward the only place that had ever held them without question, without condition. The abbey's walls, though worn and weary, still stood with the quiet grace of things that understand sorrow. It welcomed them like returning breath. There, behind the cloistered halls, was a garden few ever saw. Walled in stone, shaded by ancient olive trees that had somehow survived the cold northern soil. A place not for ceremony, but for memory. Monks who had passed were buried here, their names carved into small stones, their lives marked not by titles, but by stillness. Lucia and Tomas found refuge there, not as guests, not as fugitives, but as themselves, bare, broken, alive. For a time they were left alone. The monks, recognizing the wear of grief and betrayal, said nothing. Sister Miriam returned once, left herbs and oils for healing, then disappeared again into the silence she had always worn like a robe. Tomas slept beside Lucia each night on the cool garden floor, wrapped in a shared blanket of wool and breath. When she was strong enough, they walked among the graves, read the names, spoke of nothing, just moved, slowly, as though time had melted and they were now living inside the space between heartbeats. But the world had not forgotten them. The manor had been humiliated, the warlord's son shamed. Their return and escape had stoked something in the noble court, an anger made sharper by the silence of the abbey's protection. Soon word came that the monastery itself had received a writ, surrender the fugitives or face punishment. The monks would not comply. But they could not fight. They had no weapons, only words. And so Tomas made a choice, not of surrender, but of sacrifice. He began carving something in the garden, a hollow in the earth beneath the olive tree at the center. It was not done with tools, only hands. The monks watched. One by one, they left him to it. The soil turned quietly beneath his fingers, dark and damp. Lucia understood. Though she had regained her strength, she knew the wound of betrayal had opened something deeper inside her, something not easily closed. Her name, her title, her lineage, these were now weapons others could wield, and she was done being used. They would not run again, but they would write their ending. That night, under the moon, they sat together in the garden. The wind moved softly through the branches above, the leaves rustling like whispers from another life. Tomas lit a single candle. From the folds of his cloak he brought the last page of the manuscript he had copied for her. On it, one final verse, written in his hand. Lucia held it close, then pressed her forehead to his. By morning they were gone. The candle had burned low beside them. Their hands were still joined. Their bodies lay curled at the base of the olive tree, peaceful and untouched. No violence, no struggle, just two lives, folded gently into each other like prayer. The monks buried them beneath the same stone. No epitaph, only a carved rose, and beside it a falcon's wing. But their story did not stay buried. When the court learned of their end, something strange happened. What had once been seen as rebellion became tragedy. The noble families whispered not of disgrace but of loss, of love misunderstood, of a cruelty that had gone too far. The Kalman family fell into silence. The warlord's house turned inward, and young nobles across the region, once bound by arranged vows, began to speak of love in different terms. Laws shifted, slowly, quietly, but they shifted. Restrictions loosened. Marriages became less rigid. The right to choose, a seed long buried, began to push up through the soil. And in the garden of St. Balint's Abbey, where two graves lay beneath a tree that never lost its leaves, pilgrims began to arrive. Lovers, widows, poets, all bringing small offerings, fragments of letters, pressed flowers, torn pages of books, where names had been written in the margins. No monument was built, but their story endured. Tomas and Lucia, lovers who lived in silence then died in peace, had not failed. They had changed the world without shouting, and sometimes that is the loudest thing love can do. Decades passed, as quietly as dust settling on stone. The abbey aged gently, its walls softened by wind and time. Moss crept across the cloisters. The olive tree in the garden grew thicker, its branches reaching a little farther each year. The graves beneath it remained undisturbed, two names unspoken, two lives remembered in silence. Time did not erase them, it only softened the edges. The world beyond the monastery shifted. The courts changed faces, borders blurred, wars came and went like passing storms. The names that once held power faded, some disgraced, others merely forgotten. But in the quieter corners of the land, a story remained, not written in law, not carved into monuments, but carried in voice. The first time the song was sung, it was whispered beside a fire in a market square. Just a few lines passed from an old bard to an eager apprentice. It was called The Rose and the Blade. No one knew who wrote it. It didn't matter. The words had the weight of truth behind them, and they moved through the world like birds who had waited too long to fly. The melody was soft, steady, slow, the kind that lingered long after it ended. It told of a noblewoman with fire in her blood, and a blacksmith's apprentice who read by moonlight, of a kiss beneath ruined stone, of letters folded into holy texts, of a duel without death, and a garden where silence became sanctuary. It did not tell their names, but those who needed to know knew. They said the woman gave up a crown, that she chose love over land, fire over comfort. They said the man walked away from freedom to carry her through poison, and that his silence echoed louder than the war drums of kings. And when the song reached the noble houses, something strange happened. They didn't ban it. They listened. The same names that once sent riders in pursuit of Tomas and Lucia now paid coin to hear their tale in full. Their children memorized the verses. Their scribes wrote the lyrics into books beside fables and scripture. And in time, the song no longer belonged to one place. It travelled east across forests, west to the coastal cities. It was heard in candlelit inns and beneath high cathedral arches, always soft, always slow. Some believed it was just a story. a cautionary tale about forbidden love. Others knew better, because in the garden behind St. Balint's Abbey, the stone still sat beneath the olive tree, weather-worn, unmarked except for a rose and a falcon's wing, no name, no date. But offerings still appeared. Small things, pressed violets wrapped in ribbon, bits of poetry inked on torn parchment, coins from distant lands, left at the base of the tree as if in quiet gratitude. Lovers still came, those who had loved without permission, those who had been told to forget, those who chose to remember anyway. And somewhere far from the abbey, a man still sang, his hair now streaked with grey, his voice worn by years and wind. But the story had not aged. It lived in him as if it had just happened. He carried it not for fame, not for coin, but because something in it still breathed. At the edge of a village once ruled by men who outlawed love, he sang beneath the stars. And the people who listened did not cheer, they did not clap, they simply sat, still as stones, caught in something larger than themselves. Because they understood. Some stories are not meant to be buried. Some truths, once spoken, ripple far beyond the moment they were born. And love, when it is chosen freely, when it dares to bloom against the cold weight of law and expectation, does not die with those who live it. It becomes legend. Not in the way of myth, but in the way of memory. Tomas and Lucia did not change the world with speeches or swords. They did not wear crowns or leave children to inherit their names. They simply lived one impossible love, completely, bravely, quietly, and that was enough. Their song still plays where hearts still reach, where glances are stolen in quiet chapels, where letters are folded into secret books, where love arrives uninvited and stays, no matter what the world commands. And beneath an olive tree in a forgotten monastery, two graves still lie side by side, still, silent, unbroken.